So I've been asked to do a video lecture on the topic of defense mechanisms. I have previously done one on the subject of anxiety, and that might well be a good preliminary to watch before the one I'm about to make now, because of course Freud situates his discussion of defenses within his overall theory of anxiety. Remember the distinction between traumatic, or sometimes he calls it automatic anxiety, which is the experience of being overwhelmed and helpless. And in order to avoid having that kind of anxiety, he speaks of signal anxiety as a small dose of anxiety that serves as a signal, and that initiates defensive maneuvers precisely to avoid trauma. Okay, defense mechanisms are defenses against mental pain. And of course, mental pain can sometimes be converted into physical pain. The whole subject of psychosomatics becomes relevant here, and hysteria. The difference, of course, being that in psychosomatic illness, you have real medical illness, you have tissue changes that are thought to be caused to a degree by psychological and emotional processes. That's psychosomatic illness, real illness, with psychological and emotional causes, as opposed to hysteria, which is essentially mimicry of illness, but not conscious mimicry. That would be malingering, but a kind of unconscious mimicry. So these are pseudo-physical conditions. These are essentially dramas that employ the body and that reflect somatic preoccupation, quite distinct from real psychosomatic illness. In any case, the point is that sometimes people avoid mental pain by shunting it into their bodies, or at least into a drama involving the body. Okay, mental pain takes many different forms. Anxiety, obviously, depression, outright fear, anger, can be a painful emotional state. Envy can be a painful emotional state. Longing, pining. Well, we could go on listing the varied forms of mental pain. The point is that in the face of mental pain, which we find unbearable, we often institute defensive maneuvers. A good measure of psychological and emotional maturity is one's capacity to bear mental pain. I'm thinking here of the contributions of Wilfred Bion, who argues that early in life we are all presented with a kind of decision. Do we choose to learn how to bear mental pain, or do we choose to evacuate it, get rid of it? Do we become committed to seeking to have a painless life, or are we deciding to accept that life is painful, that mental pain is an unavoidable aspect of authentic human living. And do we therefore decide to try to learn how to bear it? The more able we are to bear unavoidable, inevitable suffering, in many ways, the healthier we are. Freud had this concept of human malaise, by which he meant the kind of suffering that human beings encounter that is nobody's fault. It's not the parents' fault. It's not society's fault. It's existential. Freud didn't use that term, but we can certainly legitimately think of such unavoidable, inevitable pain as existential, a part of the human condition. The pain of knowing that we're going to die, the pain of the various losses that we encounter in the course of our lives. I well recall my old friend and mentor, Eli Sagan, one day saying to me, "Don, do you want to know the secret of aging?" I said, "Sure, Eli." He said, "It's loss, and it's more loss." Well, I think he got that right. Loss is an inevitable part of human existence. It's for this reason that some people are unable or refuse to love. Because, of course, loving sets you up for painful loss. Not just loving other human beings, but caring about anything. Letting yourself care about anything sets you up for loss. If you care for a dog, you will lose the dog, unless the dog loses you first. So living a caring life sets you up for loss. The fear of that loss, before it actually happens, is painful. And then, of course, the loss itself and having to mourn the loss is painful. So mental pain is a part of the human condition, human malaise. Nobody's fault. And then, of course, there's all of the pain that is somebody's fault, that is the fault of others, their ill treatment of me, their abandonment of me, their abuse of me, their neglect of me. So that's a whole other category of suffering. So the existential suffering that is nobody's fault, and then all of the, what we could call surplus pain, that is somebody's fault, that results from social injustice. Okay. There's a good discussion of all of this by Freud in Civilization and Its Discontents. He discusses the various categories of suffering. He talks about how human beings have always found ways of getting intoxicated in the face of pain. Okay, people seek to defend themselves against mental pain. Some people are desperate to avoid mental pain because they can't bear it. what is it that enables some people to be better able to bear mental pain than others? I think that has to do with probably certain genetic, hereditary, temperamental factors. We know that newborns have different temperaments. Some wake up, they have a little suck, they go blissfully back to sleep. Others rage. They can't seem to get satisfaction. They seem to be in pain and anger. So I don't think we can deny certain temperamental factors, but of course those temperaments may themselves already be reactions to something that went on during intrauterine life. I mean, surely the mother's emotional state while she's carrying the baby have to affect the baby. I think we have evidence clearly that it does. And then there's the delivery itself. Okay, so there are these kinds of factors. But I think Bion makes a great contribution in his discussion of the container and the contained, of containment. The mother's, or I should say the primary caretaker's job is to be able to offer containment to the distressed child who projectively identifies its pain into the caretaker, and the caretaker should therefore be able to mentally process the child's pain. Bion would say to work it over in the caretaker's reverie, to subject it to alpha function, that is to symbolize it, think about it, resonate with it, experience it imaginatively, and to contain it, and in such containment to kind of detoxify it, and then hand it back in this detoxified form. This is an elaborate form of soothing, maternal care, maternal responsiveness, being able to bear the baby's pain. The baby may not be able to bear it itself at the beginning, but if mother can bear it, can take it in, bear it, process it, symbolize it, and then give it back in a detoxified form that the baby can actually take in and begin to tolerate, to bear. I think I guess what I'm saying is that the quality of the early caretaking, responsiveness and soothing, certainly plays a huge role in developing the infant's, the child's capacity to bear mental and emotional pain and to sustain hope, to tolerate frustration, to be able to think and to wait, not to split excessively, to prevent everything from turning absolutely black and hopeless and despairing, but to wait for the good to return, to bear the night in the knowledge that the sun will come up, to bear the delay knowing that the caretaker will arrive with the breast or the bottle. Okay, people vary in their capacities to bear mental pain. Their capacities to suffer. Suffering is a part of human existence. Some people suffer far more than they ought to because of various forms of injustice. But even apart from injustice, there still will be suffering that must be borne in any human life. Okay. At times when the suffering, for whatever reason, seems unbearable, we resort to defense mechanisms. It's important to understand that Freud felt that there's no such thing, it can be no such thing as a time when a person no longer needs any defense mechanisms at all. Mental health is not, for Freud, a life without defenses. Everyone will need defenses at times. Some people resort to defense mechanisms far more. Some people resort to them less. But everyone will use defenses at times. I think we need to distinguish between more adaptive and less adaptive defense mechanisms. Given that we all are going to use defenses of one kind or another from time to time, the big question is whether the defenses we employ enhance our adaptation. And by adaptation, I do not mean social conformity. Unfortunately, in psychiatry and in psychoanalysis, many traditions have associated mental health with social adaptation. And I profoundly disagree with that. Bertrand Russell famously said there are some societies in which the only place a decent person can be is in jail. I might say that there are certain societies in which the only place a decent person can be is in a hospital. So when I say defenses, distinguish between defenses that enhance adaptation, I don't mean adaptation to society, because the society can be one that we ought not to adapt to. There are societies in which a healthy person will necessarily be maladapted to the corrupt or the sick society. I'm echoing Erich Fromm here, of course. The sane society. I'm echoing R.D. Laing, who famously said that with a squadron of planes, one plane could be out of formation, but the squadron might be off course, and so the plane that's out of formation might be on course. Okay, this is a perspective that has often not been well represented in the psychiatric, psychological, psychoanalytic communities, who have too often associated health with social adaptation to the point of social conformity. That's not what I mean. I mean defenses that serve emotional health, as opposed to defenses that detract from it. And I do not associate emotional and mental health with conformity, with fitting in. In other words, some people may have defenses that enable them to be effective rebels. They have defenses which help them preserve their ego strength and help them adhere to their conscience. I mean, I'm always talking about Julian Assange, but there he is, in prison in England, waiting to be extradited to America. He's being tortured as it is in England. He'll be tortured probably even more if they finally get him to America. And he's been offered various deals, corrupt deals, by Trump. He refuses. He's suffering physically, and he, of course, must be suffering emotionally, but he is not compromising. Now that takes enormous ego strength. So sometimes a person with adaptive defenses that are working to help him preserve his integrity, to help him stay with his conscience, to help him stay with his reason. That capacity may put him radically out of sync with the society around him, with the institutions around him. Okay, so I wanted to make clear what I mean by adaptive defenses. I mean defenses that help one preserve one's true self. And one's true self is directly linked, in my view, to one's conscience. Okay. So we can begin to talk about maladaptive defenses as defenses that, instead of enhancing my integrity, detract from it. Defenses that take me further away from my true self or from my conscience, rather than bringing me closer to them. These are defenses that we pay too high a price for. Too high a price in terms of sacrificing our integrity. Sacrificing our conscience. These defenses get us into trouble. These are defenses that turn us against ourselves instead of bringing us closer to ourselves. And of course, there's a whole range of defenses which in themselves could be used adaptively or maladaptively. So let's start with repression and distinguish it immediately from suppression. I think of suppression as not really a defense at all in the real sense, because suppression does not involve the unconscious. I think of true defense mechanisms as rendering something unconscious. Suppression does not make anything unconscious. It's a conscious act. I'm not going to think about this right now. I recall when I was a boy, my father, mother, and I were on the way to visit my grandmother for Thanksgiving, and we came over a hill and were the first to arrive at a terrible car crash. My father had surgical training. He was a physician. He made my mother stay in the car. He took me to the first car. The driver and the woman beside him were unconscious. My father ripped the back seat out of the car and laid it on the ground as a kind of stretcher. And he asked me to help him move the woman onto the stretcher. And then he told me to grab both of her ankles and pull. And I thought she was a midget. It was just that both of her legs were broken, and before she regained consciousness, he wanted those legs to be snapped back into place. And as I pulled the rubbery legs, they snapped back into place. He didn't have his bag with him. There wasn't that much he could do. Fortunately, another car arrived, and then an ambulance arrived, and we drove on. 5 or 6 hours or 7 or 8 hours later, we're having Thanksgiving dinner. And my father asks for the pitcher of ice water that had ice cubes in it, asked it to be handed to him. And when he took it, he kind of just held it in the air, and it started shaking. And I will never forget the sound of the clinking ice cubes. He couldn't seem to put it down. My mother got up from the other side of the table, came over to him, took the vase or the ice water from him, and put her arms around him. He sobbed. So that was an important moment for me. I had seen him be a superhero early that morning. It's very hard for a boy to have a superhero as his father. How are you going to live up to that? But then I saw he wasn't exactly a superhero, or maybe he was both a superhero and an ordinary human being who could shake and could sob as a result of the trauma that he had witnessed that morning. So at the time, in the emergency situation, he used suppression. I'm not going to think about this right now. He didn't repress the trauma, though. It came back maybe 8 hours later, and he suffered it. Okay. Suppression does not set up a repression barrier. So it's kind of a conscious defense, very much used by emergency workers, by surgeons. Okay, it's a necessary defense, but it doesn't set up a repression barrier. Repression, on the other hand, does set up a censorship barrier, which involves a kind of, I won't say unintegration. You no longer have an integrated mind once you resort to repression, because you are dividing your mind into these compartments, conscious and unconscious. Repression is generally not just of the one painful thing that you're trying to get rid of. You also have to get rid of a lot of things that are associated with that unwanted traumatic experience or memory. These are things that will remind you of it. So you have to get rid of it, but you have to also get rid of the things that will remind you of it. So a certain chunk of your experience and of your lived experience and of your life and of you is excised, cut out, and put away underground in the unconscious. Wherever there is repression, there is resistance to the return of the repressed. One of Freud's very important ideas, the unconscious return of the repressed, the disguised return of the repressed. The repressed doesn't quite return in the way that it originally was before being repressed. It comes back in disguised forms. It comes back as symptoms. It comes back in slips and dreams, symptomatic acts of various kinds. Resistance to the return of the repressed. So I remember a colleague, a psychiatrist who was a classmate in the Psychoanalytic Institute during my training, and he and I were both hockey fans, and I had season tickets for the Maple Leafs. And as students, as candidates, we'd had to endure this teacher who was a tall, senior, gray-haired psychiatrist who had been a U-boat commander under the Nazis. Whether he was a Nazi, I don't know, but he served as a U-boat commander under the Nazis. He was an imposing man. I think kind of a cruel man, because he greeted the candidates and went around the table and found a little zinger, a little slightly mocking kind of statement about the identity of each of the candidates. My friend was Jewish and had lost relatives to the Nazis. His family were participants in the resistance in Paris during the war, and several family members had been murdered by the Gestapo. And so here he is, they're sitting in this class with this ex-German U-boat commander running the class in his authoritarian way. So now it's like a decade or more later, and my friend and I are between periods at the hockey game having a beer, and for some reason I was reminded of that teacher we had, and I reminded him of it, and he had zero memory of it. It had happened only 10 years earlier, and we had been taught by this man, I think, for 5 consecutive weeks. And my friend had just erased the whole experience. I wasn't out to analyze my friend, so I don't know how the repressed was returning or had returned in disguised forms in his life, but it was pretty clear that he had subjected it to repression. Okay. Repression is considered one of the higher level defense mechanisms. This is a way that we distinguish the different defenses, higher level versus lower level. I think using the Kleinian model, we could say that some defenses operate more in the depressive reparative position, and others belong more clearly to the paranoid schizoid position. In other words, the higher level defenses we see in people who are broadly neurotic. The lower level defense mechanisms we see in people who are more likely to be diagnosed borderline and or psychotic. Okay, repression is associated with neurosis. It takes a fair amount of ego strength to be able to repress. Some people are less able to do that. They must resort to more primitive defenses. I'm thinking of certain films. Certain films beg for psychoanalytic interpretation because these films are like neurotic people. There's a division between the manifest and the latent content. And when you're watching the film, if you're a psychoanalyst, you can feel and sometimes glimpse the repressed behind the manifest. So you're aware that there's a subtext, and you're listening with the third ear, And there's an unconscious narrative, a repressed narrative, that you're becoming aware of in this film, just as you're becoming aware of the repressed narrative when you're sitting with a neurotic person who is freely associating. On the other hand, there are some films that seem to have no repression. I mean, you're looking at psychosis. Very little disguise. Okay, let's use the language primary and secondary process. Secondary process thinking is the rational thinking of daily life. Primary process is the logic and the language of dreams and of psychosis. And some films operate on a primary process level. Very little disguise. Blue Velvet. Not a heck of a lot to interpret, really, in that film. It's all there on the surface. Okay, higher level and lower level defenses. So we're talking about the higher level, suppression, if it's a defense at all, really, because it's conscious. Repression, certainly a major defense mechanism that we see in neurotics. Certainly, repression plays a large role in certain types of hysteria. I think in the past we might have said in hysteria per se. I would never say that now. Of course, it's hard to define what we mean exactly by hysteria. In some circles, the term hysteria has disappeared. The borderline diagnosis seems to have replaced hysteria for many, and therefore a lot of what we consider hysteria is more primitive than the conditions in which we think that repression is commonly seen. So a lot of hysterics are not exactly repressing. These are hysterics who are operating more on the pre-Oedipal, more on the paranoid schizoid level. Neurotic hysteria, of course, is centrally involved with repression. But a lot of what passes for hysteria is not really that neurotic. It's more borderline and sometimes even psychotic. Repression plays a role in obsessive compulsive disorders. All of the neurotic disorders, you're going to see repression to some degree. Maybe less so in narcissistic and in perverse formations. And when I talk about narcissism and perversion, I want to say that there is neurotic narcissism and there is neurotic perversion. Not all narcissism is borderline or psychotic. Some people, Otto Kernberg would say that narcissistic personality disorder has an underlying borderline structure, maybe, I don't know. I do know that there are forms of narcissism, by which I mean excessive self-centeredness, egotism, and this can take two forms. There's the grandiose narcissist. It's all about him and he's wonderful. But then there is the negative narcissism of the person who, the depressed narcissist, but it's still all about him. It's all about how bad he is. So for some narcissists, it's all about how good he is. For other narcissists, it's all about how inadequate and bad he is. Both are forms of self-centeredness. Narcissistic people have trouble recognizing the reality of the other. They have lesser degrees of empathy for others. Extreme narcissism blends into psychopathy. But there are less severe forms of narcissism among people who operate on a more neurotic level, people who are capable, competent, reasonably well adapted to their professions, occupations, often quite high functioning socially, but just very self-centered. And again, that can take a grandiose or a depressed form. More severe narcissistic disorders are operating more on the borderline and even the psychotic level. Okay. So we're talking about higher level and lower level defenses. Along with repression, reaction formation. Reaction formation always involves repression. I repress one thing and I support the repression by exaggerating the opposite impulse or feeling. So I repress my depressed feelings, my down states, and I exaggerate the opposite. I'm not down, I'm up. I'm not low, I'm high. And so here we have a kind of mania, a kind of hypomania. I'm moving fast, I'm flying. Why? Because the hounds of hell are nipping at my heels. I'm having to ward off the crash into the depression. So I have to keep moving. I have to keep moving, and it's as if I have to keep moving faster and faster to avoid the crash into the underlying depressed state. There are degrees of mania. There are mild manic states which can pass for normal. The person just seems very happy-go-lucky and energetic and maybe talking a little too fast, and but then, you know, we can start to go higher, and one is so high one can't sleep, one can't turn off one's mind, etc., etc. So reaction formation. Methinks thou dost protest too much. One is going to the opposite. I don't love her. I don't even like her. I can't stand being around her. I don't want anything to do with her. That may be the reaction formation, and then it collapses, and suddenly one is deeply in love. You see this particularly among pre-adolescents who, for the boy, girls are icky, and he protests too much. He's very interested in them. He's mostly interested in tormenting them one way or another, trying to convince himself that he's not attracted until the defense collapses. Okay. I'm not afraid of heights. I become a mountain climber, or I become a parachuter. Okay, I think we're all pretty familiar with reaction formation. A neurotic level defense. First there's the repression, then there's the support of the repression by exaggerating the opposite. Then we move into the whole field of displacement. It's very important to distinguish between, well, let me talk about the different types of displacement. The classic example, he asks his boss for a raise, the boss laughs in his face, he comes home and he kicks the cat. Okay, he's displaced his anger at the boss onto the cat. This is also a substitution. He substitutes the cat for the boss whom he would like to kick. Okay, displacement substitution. This takes different forms. Sometimes we substitute ourselves. I'm angry at the boss. It's too scary to be angry at the boss. If I show my anger, I could get fired. So instead, I turn my anger at him back around against myself. This is turning against the self. It's a form of displacement and a form of substitution. I substitute myself and attack myself. This is huge in depression. You can't begin to understand depression unless you understand this central mechanism of deflecting anger, hate, rage away from the other, because it's too dangerous to hate the other. You turn it around against yourself and you beat yourself. Of course, Freud says this is the central mechanism in superego formation. The little boy's hatred of his father, by the way, that's an ambivalent hatred because he also loves father, and that's part of why the hatred is so unbearable. It's difficult to bear hating someone you love. So there's a motive for turning the hate back against yourself. There's also the fear that he might retaliate. Anyway, the formation of the superego is essentially that. One's hatred for the Oedipal rival is turned back against oneself, and now one has a superego. That's the core of the superego. The second layer of the superego is internalization of the culture's folkways, mores, laws, norms. You know, psychoanalysts haven't had enough appreciation of the fact that the superego is normative. It's not essentially moral. It's socially constructed and socially relative values that are internalized. And often these socially constructed and culturally relative norms that are taken into the superego and that constitute the second layer, the first layer being aggression turned against the self, second layer, internalization of socially relative norms, many of which are racist, sexist, heterosexist, classist, etc. Psychoanalysts are not famous for their critique of the superego, which is loaded with crap. It's not essentially a moral agency at all. Conscience is another matter. And of course, Freud conflated conscience with superego, and psychoanalysts have conflated conscience with superego ever since. And I've called repetitively to separate conscience and ego ideal out from the superego into which Freud folded them in 1923. Big mistake. Okay, we're talking about turning against the self, a core mechanism in superego formation. The superego is a sadistic agent because it's fueled by my sadism that I redirect away, that I displace away from others and turn back on myself. And so now I have a sadistic agent inside myself that is out to harm me, punish me, limit me, torment me. Okay, what's the solution? Move closer to one's conscience. Closer you are, the more at peace you are with your conscience, the less the superego can get at you. That's the path to emotional peace. Okay, turning against the self is a form of displacement. Sublimation is a form of displacement. Sublimation is one of the two defense mechanisms that Freud considered to be healthy. The other is suppression. If suppression is a defense mechanism, it's a healthy mechanism. Sublimation is a displacement. I displace my sexual urges, my incestuous sexual urges towards my mother, onto my kindergarten teacher, or onto a woman who in some ways resembles my mother. So this is not incestuous anymore. As a result of this displacement, I have shifted things away from an antisocial towards a prosocial expression. I displace the anger I feel towards my father as an Oedipal rival onto other people who are wrongdoers. I could become a prosecutor and employ my aggression in a moralistic way, but sublimated through the legal system, such that I am performing a pro-social service to my society by aggressively seeking to capture and prosecute criminals. Or I may sublimate my aggression into a military career. Now, of course, sublimations can break down. That which goes up in a scale of value could come down. We call that regression. A failed sublimation involves a regression to the primitive elements that composed it originally. So an angry little boy becomes a little torturer of animals. He pulls the legs off spiders and the wings off flies. And then he sublimates that a little bit and he becomes a butterfly collector. And then he sublimates it a little further and becomes interested in, I forget the technical term for people who specialize in stuffing dead animals. And next thing you know, he wants to go to medical school and he chooses surgery. Now he gets to use sharp knives to cut flesh. And he is performing a very needed function of opening people up and cutting out the cancer and saving lives. This is a very pro-social activity. He's transformed his antisocial sadism into a pro-social medical function. And he may function in a very pro-social way for many years, and then in middle age his marriage breaks down, or maybe he loses one of his children, or he's in some kind of crisis, and the sublimation begins to break down and he regresses. And now, instead of just doing a D&C, he does a complete hysterectomy when that is not needed, or instead of just removing a lump from the breast, he takes the whole breast. Okay, that's a failed sublimation. A regression has taken place. That which was displaced upwards has moved downwards again. Okay, sublimation is a crucial mechanism, not just in creativity, but in therapy. We are helping people find positive pro-social creative outlets for their dark urges. One finds a creative outlet for one's kinky sexuality. Instead of acting it out in ways that are hurtful or harmful to others, or harmful to oneself, or just repressing them and becoming therefore sexually inhibited or sexually dead, one finds a way to know about one's kinks and to deploy them creatively with a willing accomplice. Sergio Benvenuto's wonderful book on perversion. What is perversion? He refers to, quotes, perverts who find a willing accomplice. And together they work out in a sublimated way an exciting sex life in which nobody is forced, nobody is hurt, but they find ways of having a thrilling and creative sex life by de-repressing and sublimating urges that, if acted out in a raw, concrete, primitive form, would be destructive. But this is a couple that have found a creative way of transforming that into mutual pleasure. Okay, that's creative sublimation. Of course, the arts. And Benvenuto points out that in order to understand perversion, one has to understand the artistic elements, the costumes, the roles, the dramas. This is a dramaturgical view of human sexuality, not just perverse sexuality, but all human sexuality has to be understood dramaturgically. It involves sexual dramas. It's very different than the sexuality of animals. It's highly symbolic. The dramaturgical view is necessary here. Okay, we're talking about sublimation. Sublimation, from a Kleinian point of view, also is linked to reparation. What do we do with our guilt? Is our guilt going to be so unbearable that we are crushed by it, that we have to whip ourselves endlessly? Or can we do something creative with our guilt? Instead of flagellating ourselves with persecutory guilt and shame, maybe we can take that and displace it in a sublimated way that is reparative, symbolically reparative. So why become a healer? I'm guilty about hurt that I have inflicted on people in the past. I can't go back and do anything about that, but I can strive to be a reparative person, a person who helps repair in my career as a therapist or a physician or a nurse, whatever, helping people, a helper. I was a herder, so I'm driven to be a helper. Now, is it a poor sublimation? In the name of helping, do I hurt? Is my underlying sadism leaking into the very activities that I claim to be intending to help? That's a poor sublimation. The underlying sadism is sneaking into the reparative action. This is a physician who has a lousy bedside manner. This is a physician who wanted to help, but maybe he hurls painful diagnoses in people's face. Okay, there are a lot of ways sublimations may fail, but sublimations may sometimes brilliantly succeed, and a person manages to atone for his sins, make reparation for his destructiveness by finding creative and reparative activities, which could be making beautiful music, painting beautiful paintings. All of the arts offer possible outlets, building things instead of tearing them down. Okay, sublimation. I think analysts need to be reminded about the importance of sublimation, because as therapists, we want to help people find positive, pro-social, sublimated outlets for their destructive feelings and urges. This is a part of the field of transformation. I mean, therapy seeks to help people transform themselves from destructive and self-destructive people into helpful and creative people. This, in my view, also involves getting out from under the superego and reconciling instead with conscience, and then having conscience as one's guide and one's friend and one's defense attorney against the sadistic Gestapo-like superego. I mean, this is a big part of the cure, and that's a transformation. And sublimation is crucial in this kind of transformation. Of course, the Jungians, Jung always loved the metaphor of alchemy, transforming the base metal into gold. As a metaphor, it's a pretty good metaphor. Okay, sublimation is a form of displacement, as is turning against the self. Okay. Well, I want to go to projection, but we're talking really about the healthier defense mechanisms. Projection is probably more belongs to the less healthy, more primitive defense mechanisms, although we see projection in neurosis, we see it in ordinary life. So, sometimes it operates on the paranoid schizoid level and therefore is a destructive primitive defense, but sometimes it operates on the depressive position level, projection. Let's really underline the difference between displacement. Oh, and by the way, one of the main forms of displacement is transference. Transference is a displacement. Feelings that I had towards my father or my mother are displaced onto my feelings towards my therapist. I'm now treating my therapist as a metaphorical mother or father or sibling. Let's not forget the sibling transferences. Transferences are displacements. Feelings that I once had for a parent, I am now having towards my therapist. I remember one case in which it wasn't a parent transference. He had an older brother, and boy, the central thing in his treatment was his transference of his hated older brother onto me. That's a displacement, transference. And of course, there are positive transferences, loving. There are negative transferences, hating. There are ambivalent transferences, both loving and hating. Transference is not projection. It's displacement. Many analysts have this a little confused because the Kleinians are mostly talking not about displacement, they're talking about projection. And when they talk about the transference, they're talking about something that results from projection, not from displacement. When the Freudians talk about transference, they're talking about displacement and substitution. When the Kleinians talk about the transference, they're talking about the result of projection or projective identification. And there's great confusion because of this. So let's look at the difference, first of all, between displacement and projection. You come into your therapist's office and you're convinced that he's angry. And for the sake of argument, let's say he is not angry, but you're convinced he is. Okay, is it displacement, i.e. transference? Are you seeing your therapist as your angry father or angry mother? Is that it? Have you displaced the image of your angry father or angry mother onto your therapist? That's displacement. That's transference. Or are you angry? You've repressed your anger, and you've backed up the repression with a projection. You're projecting your unconscious anger, the anger you do not want to know you have. You are projecting that onto your therapist. These are two very different situations. I'm angry in one case, and I'm projecting that into my therapist. In the other case, I'm not angry. But I had an angry father or mother, and I'm transferring that onto my therapist. Crucially different mechanisms involved here. Well, while we're on the subject of that, let's turn to projective identification. First of all, let me say that Melanie Klein, by projective identification, she didn't mean much more than what the Freudians mean by projection. In other words, for Melanie Klein, projective identification is my fantasy, unconscious, spelled with a PH, my unconscious fantasy that bits of me, like my anger, now reside in you. I see you as angry. I don't see me as angry, but I'm angry unconsciously, and I'm seeing that in you. That's just projection. Why does she call it projective identification? She makes it a little broader. For the Freudians, projection is usually projection of impulses, feelings. For Klein, by projective identification, she means all that, but she also means exporting, say, my whole superego into you. I don't want to know what my superego is saying, so I projectively identify my superego into you. In my fantasy, you embody it, and you are reproaching me. Or I could put my entire id into you. I'm not a hostile, lustful, but you are. I'm not a pervert, but you are. So she expands the mental contents that can be seen as residing in the other. But essentially, she's talking about projection. She does not mean anything interpersonal. She's working with a one-body, not a two-body psychology. She's not talking about how my projections affect you. She's not talking about how the patient's projections affect the analyst. That's not Melanie Klein. A supervisee came to her and said his patient was putting her confusion into him. She said, "No, dear, you're confused." Okay, it's Wilfred Bion who takes the second step into interpersonal projective identification. So 2 steps now. 1, he projects or projectively identifies his anger into the therapist, seeing the therapist as angry. Step 2, he now behaves in ways that actually evoke anger in the therapist. Okay, so that patient comes in, he's convinced He's not aware that he's angry. He's convinced that I'm angry. So as he comes into the office, he looks at me and he says, "Wrong side of the bed?" I said, What? Well, did you get out of the wrong side of the bed today? You're obviously pissed at something. Really? What makes you say that? I mean, what? Well, look at how you just answered me. You're already defensive. Guess what's happening? I'm starting to get angry. He's telling me that he knows more about my mental state than I do. What is this? Okay, so first of all, he simply sees his anger in me, but now he acts towards me in ways that actually elicit my anger. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's interpersonal projective identification, a crucially important mechanism. I mean, the cliche is that Freudians analyze the transference, the displacements. Kleinians analyze the countertransference. That is, they analyze the feelings that are put into them or evoked in them by patients. Well, I'm both Freudian and Kleinian. I look for transference, displacement, but I also look for projection and projective identification. But these are very different mechanisms that, unfortunately, are very confused in today's psychoanalysis. Okay. Projection, central to paranoid states. My rage and anger, I export out. It's out there now in the world, and it's coming back at me in a very threatening way. People are out to get me. The whole world has become persecutory. There's too much noise. It's too bright. The damn birds are singing too loudly. The traffic noise is unbearable. COVID-19 is everywhere. Persecutory states as a result of projection. Paranoia. Paranoia, obviously, is widespread. Widespread states of persecutory anxiety. Okay, we're talking about projection and projective identification. Very different from displacement. Other defenses on the more neurotic level, well, dissociation. Freud called this isolation. He distinguished two types of isolation: isolation of affect and isolation of thoughts. Now, isolation of affect means no more than repression of affect. I don't think it's a separate mechanism. Let's call it what it is: repression of affect. You might remember the party that you attended, but you've repressed any memory of that shameful and embarrassing thing you did there that night. That's gone, along with the feelings of shame or the feelings of guilt or whatever. So you still have the memory, but you've repressed the affect. Freud called that isolation of affect. Why didn't he just call it repression of affect? That's what it amounts to. And there's always a return of the repressed. That repressed affect is going to come back somehow in a disguised form. Okay, but then he spoke of this other type of isolation, isolation of thoughts. And really what he's referring there to is dissociation, which means compartmentalization of mind. I'm putting my thoughts into two separate airtight compartments that are not allowed to meet. Okay, so there are mild forms of this. Hypocrisy. Consciously, I think of myself as someone who stands against prejudice and discrimination, and believes in equality and democracy, is against racism and ethnocentrism, etc., etc., in one compartment of my mind. But in this other compartment that I don't want to know about, I belong to a club that will not admit Jews or black folks. And I keep that walled off. Because if I allowed those things to come together, I would either have to redefine myself and give up seeing myself as anti-racist, anti-whatever discrimination. I would have to admit that I'm very flawed in this regard. I belong to a club that discriminates. That means I discriminate. Or I would have to resign from the club. And maybe I don't want to resign from the club. So I don't face this contradiction by using this defense mechanism of dissociating these conflicting facts into separate compartments that are not allowed to meet. The left hand does not get to know what the right hand is doing. Dissociation. Jean-Paul Sartre is brilliant at describing seduction in these terms. Apparently, she and I are having an intellectual discussion, friendly, nothing sexual is happening, at least above the table, but underneath the table, maybe the knees are touching and the legs, and maybe even on top of the table, the hands are touching, and so two things are going on at the same time. The left hand is trying not to know what the right hand is doing. That's a kind of dissociation or isolation. It's interesting that that is a vertical split rather than a horizontal split. I mean, in his early work, Freud very much had repression as the main defense mechanism. That's a horizontal split. What's up on the conscious or the pre-conscious is split off by a wall of censorship from what is down here in the unconscious. Horizontal split. But in his later work, he seemed to be switching a little bit more and more towards a vertical split. So earlier workers in the field had really worked more with dissociation. Freud got away from dissociation and pushed repression instead, but in his late work, he seems to be coming back more to a dissociation way of understanding the splits in the mind. And of course, Heinz Kohut, in his self-psychology, will rely very heavily on this idea of vertical splitting instead of horizontal splitting in the mind. This is very different from what Melanie Klein means by splitting, which is all good, all bad, idealized, devalued. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about compartmentalization of the mind. Okay, well then there are the neurotic defenses of intellectualization. Again, the affects are kind of buried, or there's a heavy transformation of affect into intellectualizing, which becomes a kind of passionate intellectualizing. Anna Freud is good on this in The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense, where she describes, say, a father and a daughter. She's adolescent, so her early Oedipus feelings are perhaps coming up. She's blossoming into a woman, and but she can't afford to know anything about her incestuous longings for Daddy, and Daddy's in the same boat. He can't afford to know anything about any lustful feelings he may have towards this blossoming, nubile young woman who happens to be his daughter. So he's got to get rid of his sexual feelings. She has to get rid of her sexual feelings. But they have these passionate arguments over politics and philosophy, and they go at one another. He thrusts, she parries. He thrusts, she parries. If you look at it from the outside, it could almost look like in, out, intercourse. Intellectual, passionate, intellectual intercourse. Okay, intellectualization. It's a real challenge to try to analyze an intellectual who's heavily into psychoanalytic theory. I'm an intellectual. I'm trying to be an analyst, but my patient is a young intellectual, passionately concerned about psychoanalytic ideas, and the sessions can easily deteriorate into seminars instead of getting on trying to understand his unconscious. So great self-control is needed on the part of the analyst to not be drawn into that, and on the part of the patient to try to not let himself indulge that too much. Intellectualization. Rationalization. A lot of people think that rationalization is giving false reasons, false motives for actions. Sometimes it is, but good rationalization usually involves talking about real motives for the action that you've undertaken, acknowledging. Well, let me take an example. Carveth, why did you become a psychoanalyst? Well, I wanted to help people. Okay, that's true. But if we leave it there, we've got a pretty superficial understanding. What else might have been at work? Well, it's hard to survive these days on an academic income. I wanted to earn more money. I wanted to have a second stream of income. That's true. A little less admirable than wanting to help people, wanting to make more money, but it's part of the truth. Is that it? Should we? No, let's go further. I'm nosy. And I'm a bit voyeuristic. I want to know about the dark side. I want to know about the hate and the lust. I want to know what goes on in the bedroom. I can't be there, but I can hear about it. Now, hopefully, I'm going to have my interest in all of that pretty well sublimated, and so I'm going to do something creative and reparative and sublimated with what I'm hearing. But if you ask, why did I become a psychoanalyst? I mean, psychoanalysis used to be pretty centered on sexuality. Not so much anymore. The relational and self-psychology people have tended to take it pretty far away from sexuality and aggression and the perverse. But I mean, why does one become a gynecologist? Why does one become a psychoanalyst? There are many motives, different motives. Okay, we're talking about the defense mechanism of rationalization. A good rationalizer doesn't tell a lie, but he only tells part of the truth. He tells the acceptable part of the truth and doesn't mention the less acceptable parts of the truth. Sometimes it may involve an outright lie, but much rationalization is talking only about a piece of the puzzle. Okay, rationalization. Okay, there are other neurotic defenses. There's no way that we can make a definitive list. And I wanted to make the more general point that, and Charles Brenner makes this point quite clearly, that any function of the mind can be used defensively. So in a way, Brenner suggests there's no point in drawing up great long lists of defense mechanisms because everything that the mind can do can be done defensively. And I think he's quite right about that. That's true, but that's not a reason to make a list of defense mechanisms. One should make a list of defense mechanisms anyhow because it clarifies our thinking and it enables us to teach. So yeah, we need lists, but there can be no definitive list. I think Anna Freud mentions 10 in The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense. Another good book is George Vaillant, V-A-I-L-L-A-N-T, George Vaillant, The Ego and whatever. He's got several books out, but in a couple of them he gives a much longer list, more like 20 or 25 defense mechanisms. Okay, I've been talking about the higher level defenses. Then there are the lower level defenses. Denial. Denial is a primitive defense mechanism because it threatens the ego's main function, which is reality testing, distinguishing fact from fantasy. And if that breaks down, we have psychosis. We become out of touch with reality. And denial of reality. See, repression is a defense against feelings. Denial is a defense against facts. People say they deny their feelings. That's not a technically correct usage of the term. We don't deny feelings, we deny facts. Okay. In childhood, it's normal. Children engage in denial. We support their denial. We don't expose them to facts too soon because they will be overwhelmed. Children deny the fact that they are little and relatively powerless, and they support the denial with fantasies that they are Superman or Superwoman. We support this defensive denial and these defensive identifications with superheroes. Okay, they've got a lot to cope with, being small, weak, and vulnerable, and they use denial. But as we move into adult life, the use of denial is a very dangerous mechanism. Adults frequently deny threatening facts. There are people who will not go to a doctor. They would rather not know if they have a debilitating disease. They would rather just die of it rather than learn that it's coming and take steps to cure it or mitigate it. They just don't want to know. And they avoid doctors and tests. Or they go on smoking. Denying the threat to their health, or drinking, denying the threat to their health. Well, widespread denial of the fact of anthropogenic climate disruption, which threatens human existence on this planet. Then there are those who outright desire to destroy human existence on this planet. Chomsky thinks that Donald Trump is not going to just accidentally cause the destruction of life on this planet. He seeks to destroy it. Chomsky thinks, to use the concepts of Erich Fromm, that Trump is a necrophilic character, a death-seeking character. In any case, there widespread denial. People just don't want to face the facts. They can't bear the facts. They can't bear the anxiety that would be generated if they looked clearly at the facts. So they deny the facts. Primitive defense mechanism. The ostrich, burying your head in the sand. Not wise. Of course, these people have to become anti-science, because science is the process of seeking the truth, seeking the facts, and looking at them. So people who are heavily into denial don't want science. This is obviously a story that we see all around us these days. Okay, primitive defense, splitting. Another primitive defense, dividing the world in a Manichaean way. In Manichaeism, there is a good God who is all good, and there is an evil God who is all bad. And boy, that solves the monotheistic problem. How can God be omnipotent and benevolent and yet permit the suffering of the innocents? This is a huge problem for Judeo-Christian and Islamic theology. But it's not a problem once we go to Manichaeism. There's a good God who is responsible for all the good, and there's a separate God entirely who's responsible for all of the bad. Well, we're all Manichaeans in the paranoid schizoid position. The world is split. Others are either all good or all bad, and the self is either all good or all bad. There is no ambivalence. And of course, it is this paranoid schizoid splitting that we see among the totalitarians of the right and the new totalitarians of the left, the social justice warriors, for whom everything is split. You're either for us or you're against us. Cancel culture. If you're not totally for us, let's cancel your tenure at the university. Let's expel you from social media. No concern for free speech. No time for free speech. This is the totalitarianism of the left, and it's the new Puritanism of the left that has even infected psychoanalysis these days. Psychoanalysis that used to be all about anti-repression, facing the facts of our infantile sexuality, our polymorphous perverse sexuality, our Oedipal hates, and our incestuous loves. Oh no. Much of this is denied now. We just don't go there. The new Puritanism. Splitting. All good, all bad. No ambivalence. So we have the totalitarians of the right, the totalitarians of the left. Psychoanalysis properly should operate in the middle zone where democracy lives, where there's such a thing as a loyal opposition. They're very annoying. They oppose me, but I respect and honor their right to oppose me. And I listen to the opposition. And the opposition listens to me. We don't agree. That's democracy lives in the depressive position. Sanity resides in the depressive position. But we're all prone to split. We all inhabit both PS and D, and we oscillate between the two. But mental health is a matter of being able to see that one has fallen into splitting and to dig oneself out of that quickly. Okay, splitting. Excessive projection and projective identification And I'm talking here, I mean, you have to distinguish between healthy uses of projective identification. Patients use projective identification to elicit in me some of the feelings they suffer from as a way of enhancing my capacity to empathize with them. They want me to know how it feels to be them. So they put some of their feelings in me. Now I know how they feel. And that facilitates therapy. So that's a positive use of projective identification to enhance empathy. But then there is destructive, primitive projective identification. The patient can't bear certain of his feelings, so he evacuates them. We can call this evacuative projective identification. He dumps. He has a good dump. And all that shit is now in me. I remember a patient who, as she left treatment in the weeks leading up to the termination date, she kept on finding dust and dirt in my office, unpleasant smells. She'd lie on the couch and she'd run her finger along the bookcase beside her and look at the dust on the finger. She felt great and thanked me for the therapy. She had unloaded a lot of shit into me and my office. And she walked out feeling like she'd had a good dump. Okay. Evacuative. She didn't want to deal with her shit. Evacuative projective identification. Okay. What have I left out in terms of primitive defense mechanisms, primitive use of fantasy formation where primary process thinking takes over, reality testing is impaired. Now we have delusions and illusions, and we used to think that delusions were restricted to psychotics. No way. And Leonard Shengold wrote a book called Delusions of Everyday Life to wake us up, to remind us that delusions are everywhere. Everybody suffers from pockets of delusion. And a good way of understanding psychoanalytic therapy is as the process in which, with the help of the analyst, we become acquainted with our delusions and our illusions. And once you recognize that you have a delusion, you're already significantly out of it. Because there's now a split between you as the subject who knows and you as the object who is captured by the delusion. Thomas Mann wrote, "A man is never the same once he has seen himself." As soon as I see that for a good deal of my life I've been captured by a particular delusion, I'm already a little bit outside it. And that's a good way of defining how analysis works. Of course, there are reparative elements, reparenting elements. The analyst becomes a good breast, a good mother, a good father. Yes, that relational understanding of the therapy has some validity to it, but people who go too far in that direction lose what analysis really centrally is. It's not just a good relationship. It must be that. It should be that. But your connection with this analyst should help you to understand your pathology. It should help you understand your craziness. It should help you understand your delusions and help you fight free of them. That's a central part of how analysis operates. So delusional thinking, confusing your pH fantasies for facts, that emancipation is a central element of the analytic cure. Okay, there's much that I've left out. There's no way we can do a comprehensive list of defense mechanisms, but I think that's enough for the moment. Okay.